Hello and welcome to the Bucket Lister podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. I am your host, Keith Crockford, and today I want to be talking about how to make mountains more accessible. And the reason this podcast has come about is because I'm currently in Spain. I've been working here for the last 2 weeks, and we had our Bucket List Adventure Spain week last week, and I'm out here now currently with a school group as well. And one thing that I realized so much last week was how not a lot of people really know about Via Ferratas. And it's one of the activities we did last week. It's one of the activities we've done this week with the group. And I've spent a lot of time over the years on Via Ferratas. And they are just such a really interesting way of introducing people to the mountains. Now, the first question you're probably asking, if you don't know, is what is a Via Ferrata? And a Via Ferrata is a route that's been put up a mountain to make it more accessible. And these were first added back in the around about 1880, what I think was the first Via Ferrata that was ever introduced. And what they basically did was put metal rungs up through the mountains with a steel cable for you to attach yourself to them. And it just made these mountain environments safe. And then during the First and Second World Wars, they were used for getting troops over the mountains safely and allowing troops to get into really great positions. And the militaries in the Alps were building lots of these Via Ferratas to help this situation. Moving more into the sort of the 60s, 50s, 60s, then mountaineers started using these Via Ferratas to get to these really inaccessible areas. And over the years, that's now turned into its own sport itself. And the reason why I love it so much, we had 16 clients out last week on our Adventure Spain trip. And the Via Ferrata was just one of the activity days that we did. And the interesting thing was, I think of the 16 people, there was probably only 4 of them that had ever done a Via Ferrata before. For many, they had no real idea what a Via Ferrata was. And we had some very, very funny stories to tell from taking people out on those Via Ferratas. And we did 2 different ones last week. Whilst the Adventure Spain group were here, we did, because we had so many people, obviously we can't take everyone out at the same time. So we split it into 2 groups. One went one day, one went another, and we went to 2 different destinations because there were a few people last week who had been here last year. So we wanted to give them a different one as well. Now, Via Ferratas these days they range in difficulty. And basically they get given a rating, whether it be a K2, 3, 4, 5, and the higher the number, generally the harder the Via Ferrata is. So last week, for example, we did a K4 and we did a K3 that also then led into a K5. So those were the ones that we did last week. And basically you clip yourself in at the bottom, and you follow a wire up the mountain. And, for a lot of those people that were doing the Via Ferrata last week, they would never, ever be able to climb that route as a climber. But by giving them some simple equipment and some basic instruction, they were able to make their way up into some very... I think that the thing with Via Ferrata that makes it really interesting is the fact that you can be in some really isolated situations, and you have some real exposure that you feel really safe on, that you wouldn't actually get if you were, if that wasn't there. For example, if for many people they wouldn't be able to climb and access it unless someone had gone up and bolted these metal rungs and put bridges in and put Tyrolean traverses in. And that's what makes it so cool. And now it's become a sport in its own right. And many people get to access the mountains and get to these locations by being able to do the Via Ferratas. Now, a Via Ferrata itself, in its sort of simplest form, like the one we've done with the school group this week, is literally metal rungs like a ladder that have been drilled into the rock with a cable that follows up it. And kind of every 4 or 5 meters, there'll be a bolt in the cable that you have to cross your lanyard over. And then that's what keeps you safe. But, some of the more sporting routes now have a lot of bridges that, like I say, they'll have Tyrolean traverses. They'll have one last week had a big swing on it where you had to attach yourself and swing across. That kind of, made it, the exposure that you get from doing that was just really, really amazing. And the thing is, like, you can train people to do it really, really quickly. Like, you don't really need any special skills. Obviously, you need to have a very good head for heights. Some people last week didn't have a very good head for heights. And like I say, that's some of the funny stories we have to tell. But again, they were willing to give it a go and they got through it. And at the end, although some say maybe they wouldn't do it again, they did really, really enjoy it. And I think, with a bit of a persuasion from me or from Rich, we'd get her up there again. I think she would definitely give it another go. But the lovely thing about Via Ferrata is the kit is very simple that you need. And like I say, the training is very quick to give if you are being accompanied with a guide, like we're offering in Spain at the minute. The training to do it is very, very quick. So what equipment do you need to do a Via Ferrata? Most of the equipment you need generally comes from a climbing background. So you do need to have a harness, which is a climbing harness in general. What we would class as a sit harness. So you'd have 3 loops. You'd have your waist loop, and then you'd have 2 leg loops as well. So if you were to fall off, it would put you in a seated position. You would need to have a helmet, and the helmet would need to be a climbing helmet. And that is generally for any rock fall that potentially could come down from above you. But it would also help you as well if you were to have a fall, or if someone was to fall and land on you, which shouldn't happen because you should leave a big enough gap between you and them. And then the most important thing you need then is your Via Ferrata lanyard. Now, these have come on massively over the years, and this is really the only specialist piece of kit you need to do a Via Ferrata. And basically, it is the piece of kit has 2 carabiners on the end. It's set up in a Y section, so the 2 carabiners come back to a middle point. They generally now will have a stretchy fabric leading to the carabiner to give you some stretch in there to absorb some of the shock if you were to have a fall. The carabiners should be easy to open. So you don't want to be having them with screw gate carabiners on the end, for example, because you need to be able to open them with one hand to be able to clip them into the wire quickly. And then the other most important thing that a a Via Ferrata lanyard should have now is a shock absorber within the Via Ferrata lanyard itself. Now, these are often called screamers in the world of climbing or Via Ferrata. And basically, if you were to have a fall, they would then deploy and absorb that shock that your body would be taking otherwise. And that's the most important part of a Via Ferrata lanyard. Now, some of the old Via Ferrata lanyards would have static rope, 2 carabiners on the end, and they're the ones to definitely stay away from. So if you're ever going to go in and go on a course or go and do a Via Ferrata somewhere, then if you're giving something with a static rope that doesn't have 2 stretchy ends on it and what they call a screamer, then you should be asking questions. But obviously what you don't want to be doing is, because you're clipping into this wire as you go, like I say, the wires are kind of, the bolts between the wires are kind of 4, 5, 6 meters apart. So, that's the maximum you would be able to fall if you let go of the ladder, or you slipped off something. So obviously, to take that much of a fall, if you were to land on solid rope, that's going to put a massive shock through your body. So that's why you need to make sure that you've got the screamer element. And generally, it's a little package that sits near to your harness. But they won't deploy. They need to have a massive 4-factor fall on them. You're talking about 30 kilonewtons of force going through it before it deploys. So if you just slipped off, your lanyards would take the carabiners and the stretchy bit and those bits would take that. But if you took a 4 meter fall and fell on that, and you were a 70, 80, 90 kilogram person, that would be enough to then deploy the screamer. Once the screamer's been deployed, obviously it cannot be used again, and you would need to buy a new Via Ferrata lanyard. But if you're ever coming on a course, or you're going to go and do and you're going to go do an organized trip, all of that equipment will probably be provided for you anyway. But if you've already done some climbing and you fancy having a go at Via Ferrata, you could go and do some easy ones excuse me, without any difficulty whatsoever. There are no special skills that are needed from a mountaineering perspective. You just literally need to clip the wire and cross them over one at a time, so one's always clipped to the wire, so you're never unclipped. But if you've got no experience of this, then I would certainly advise going on a course or coming on a week like we ran last week with the Bucket List Company, and experiencing getting high up into the mountains, because it is just truly stunning, and it gets you into locations and it gives you exposure that you wouldn't normally be able to get if you weren't already a rock climber, for example. So what other kit do you need? You might get you might have a sling or a lanyard as well. They're really handy. That will clip to your harness, and then you can use that if you want to have a rest while you're on there. So, for example, if you get to a steep section and your arms are really tired, you can clip yourself into one of the metal rungs and just hang there and shake your arms off. And it's much better using a static line for clipping into the rungs than using your stretchy lanyards that are attached to you. So a lot of people will have a sling or another static lanyard that they can just clip as they go up. Obviously, footwear is quite important as well. There are on quite a lot of Via Ferratas, there'll be a ladder, but there might also be a horizontal section that then uses the rock. So you need a pair of shoes that are grippy. So like an approach shoe is a brilliant option of something to take. Obviously, if you are going higher up the mountains, then you might want to be thinking more about a winter walking boot, hiking boot that has a bit more ankle protection, a bit more warmth in it. Obviously, think about the clothing you're going to wear whilst you're on the Via Ferrata. Obviously, as you're going higher, you are going to be getting colder. That wasn't an issue that we've had in Spain last week. It was very, very warm whilst we were on the Via Ferrata. But obviously, we've got a rucksack on our back. We've got water. We've got supplies. We've got food that we're taking as well. And then the other thing to potentially think about taking is a pair of gloves as well, because obviously you are climbing up metal ladders. It does, you are putting pressure through your hands. So a lot of people will have a pair of gloves with them. In the summer, fingerless gloves are great with some padding on the front, almost like a pair of cycling gloves, really. But you just want something that allows you to still be able to use the carabiners and to unclip very easily, but just kind of takes some of that pressure away from your hands as well. But, there are Via Ferratas all over the world now. It's becoming super, super popular. There are a couple you can go and pay to have a go at in the UK. Like I say, there are loads that you can just go and jump on in the Alps. The Dolomites are full of Via Ferratas. There's becoming more and more and more in Spain now. Austria's got loads. There's a great one in New Zealand that goes up a waterfall, for example. There's one on Mount Kinabalu that's at like 3,000 meters, tops out at like 3,600 meters in Borneo on Mount Kinabalu. So there are, that's really interesting, the fact that I've just said that, because Rich, who I was guiding with today, was the person that I did the first ever podcast with, who was the chap that was one of the first person to ever go through Lowe's Gully. And that's who I was guiding with today and last week, Via Ferrata in Spain. So if you haven't listened to that podcast, please go back and check out episode 1 of the Bucket Lister podcast, because we've never really mentioned that one. But Rich's story is a super interesting one. And, if you're ever going to want to be with somebody on a mountain, Rich is the guy that you want to be with. So that's who I've been with for the last 2 weeks working out with in Spain. So check out episode 1 if you haven't listened to it already. But one thing that's come out of this and listening to other people is that they want to do more and more Via Ferratas. And, it's something that I've thought about over the last 2 weeks while I've been out here, is that actually I think it could be a great long weekend out to Spain. Like, we've got access to the accommodation out here. We've got access to loads of Via Ferratas out here. So one thing I think we're going to do in the Bucket List Company next year is look at running a long weekend Via Ferrata trip that basically takes you from zero to hero on Via Ferratas. And we'll provide all the equipment, we'll provide everything. And you just need to come in, get involved and learn it. And then that will just give you that kind of the experience to then think, actually, I could go and do this elsewhere as well. So if you're listening to this and think, I would really like to have a go at that, then maybe that long weekend could be the weekend for you to think about coming out and having a go. Anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about today. It was just a quick episode to go over Via Ferratas, talk about what they are and how you could gain more access to getting into the mountains as well. You wouldn't believe it, but I am coming down with a cold, and having been in 30-degree heat for the last 2 weeks, I don't know where it's come from, but I'm still struggling on. I've got a couple of days left out here, and then I'm back in the UK for a week before I head off to Gozo to run a scuba diving trip for the Bucket List Company in about 10 days time now I head out. But anyway, I hope you found this episode interesting. I hope Via Ferrata may appear on your bucket list. But if you love the mountains and want to feel exposure, then Via Ferrata is definitely the way to go if climbing isn't really high on your bucket list. So that's it from today. I hope you found this episode interesting, and I'll be back next week with another episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. So until then, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk or follow us on socials. See you next time.